Good afternoon. NATO defense ministers will meet this week and take decisions to strengthen our security and lay the ground for our summit in Madrid next June. NATO continues to adapt to a more complex and more competitive world. We must keep our technological edge. Future conflicts will be fought not just with bullets and bombs, but also with bytes and big data. We see authoritarian regimes racing to develop new technologies, from artificial intelligence to autonomous systems. So we are taking further steps to future-proof our alliance. This week, allies will launch the NATO Innovation Fund. I expect this multinational fund to invest 1 billion euros. The fund will support the development of dual-use, emerging and disruptive technologies in key areas for allied security. At our summit in Brussels last June, we took the decision to establish a Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or DIANA. We are making good progress. It will have headquarters in both Europe and North America, with a network of test centers and accelerator sites to harness civilian innovation for our security. Many allies have made offers to host these facilities, and some of them will be in place next year. We will also agree our first ever strategy on artificial intelligence in order to integrate it in areas such as data analysis, imagery and cyber defense, and to set out the principles of safe and responsible use in accordance with international law. Earlier this week, Russia announced the closure of its mission to NATO and of our offices in Moscow. We regret this decision, which does not promote dialogue and mutual understanding. But NATO's policy remains consistent, and we remain open to dialogue, including through the NATO-Russia Council. At the same time, we will continue to assess how we can further strengthen our deterrence and defense. We will ensure we have the right plans, capabilities, and forces in place to protect our nations. We'll also review progress in our response to the challenge from Russia's nuclear-capable missile systems. In 2018, NATO allies determined that Russia has developed and deployed missiles in breach of the INF Treaty, which led to the demise of the treaty. And since then, Russia has further increased its arsenal of missiles and is developing hypersonic systems. These missiles pose a real threat to security in the Euro-Atlantic area. We will not mirror Russia's actions, but we will maintain strong deterrence and defense. Ministers will also meet in the nuclear planning group format. They will consult on how to keep our nuclear deterrence safe, secure and effective, while remaining committed to arms control. NATO's goal is a world without nuclear weapons, but we do not believe in unilateral disarmament. A world where Russia, China and other countries like North Korea have nuclear weapons, but NATO does not, is simply not a safer world. Tomorrow, we will discuss Afghanistan and how we can ensure terrorists cannot use Afghanistan as a safe haven. Allies have the capabilities to strike from far away against terrorist threats. We will also hold Taliban accountable for their commitments on terrorism, human rights and safe passage. And the international community has economic and diplomatic leverage over the Taliban. It is important that we reflect on our efforts in Afghanistan over the years. We have launched a thorough and clear-eyed assessment, and tomorrow ministers will also have a first opportunity to engage on the lessons learned process. Looking ahead, we must continue to stand together in the fight against international terrorism. And in the margins of this ministerial, we will hold a meeting of the Global Coalition to defeat Daesh. On Friday, our partners Finland and Sweden and the European Union will join us. We have already taken cooperation between NATO and the European Union to unprecedented levels, and we will take stock of our progress. We share the same values and face the same challenges, so we will discuss what more we can do together in an age of global competition. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
And we'll try to take questions both from here in the room, good to see so many of you here, but also by Zoom. We will start with Reuters, first row.
Thank you very much, Juan. Secretary General, coming to the Russia question, I wondered if you thought that the suspension of the Russian mission as a response was a proportionate one. And I wondered, secondly, where this leaves that kind of dialogue deterrent approach that you've had since Crimea. I mean, is the dialogue track now without any wheels? And thirdly, if I could just ask for your reaction to Alexei Navalny being awarded the EU top human rights prize. I mean, I think Russia would see this as interference in domestic affairs. I wonder how you see it. Thank you.
I welcome that Alexei Navalny has been rewarded with the Sakharov Prize. I think that's an important recognition of the important role he has played for many years in supporting democratic values, in being a strong voice in Russia, and also a recognition of the importance of calling on his unconditional release from prison and to have an international investigation in actually what happened. NATO allies condemned the failed assassination attack against him, and NATO allies have also called for an international investigation. I think this is a part of a pattern where we see that Russia has become more oppressive abroad and more oppressive at home and more aggressive abroad. And therefore, I welcome the fact that a strong voice, an important politician in Russia has been awarded this prize. Then on the dialogue with Russia, so we regret the position we are in now. We strongly believe that especially when tensions are high and things are difficult, it is important to have dialogue. And therefore, we will continue to work for dialogue with Russia, including in the NATO-Russia Council. And the offer to meet in the NATO-Russia Council is still on the table. It's for Russia to respond in a positive way. So far, they've not done that. And we also, of course, then regret the Russian decision to close down the 2 NATO offices in Moscow, and also to withdraw their personnel from the NATO mission in Brussels. We have to understand what NATO did was actually based on intelligence. It was based on what these people, the Russian members of the Russian delegation to NATO actually did, and they were Russian intelligence operatives. And the allies have expressed grave concern about these kind of malign activities that we have seen over the last few years, including the failed coup attempt in Montenegro, the deadly act of sabotage in the Czech Republic, the poisoning attack in Salisbury, and the hacking of the OPCW in Den Haag. So this is a pattern of Russian behavior that allies have expressed concern about. We had intelligence, and we made the decision on withdrawing the accreditation for the 8 Russian members of the Russian delegation to NATO based on intelligence. But we also at the same time made it clear that we will continue to approach Russia based on the dual-track approach, deterrence, defense, and dialogue, and also that we regret the fact that the relationship between NATO and Russia is now at the lowest point at the end of the Cold War. For us, that's actually not an argument against dialogue, that's an argument in favor of dialogue, because it is exactly when times are difficult, we have challenges and problems as we have now, that we need to sit down and talk.
Politico? Over there.
Just David Herzenorn with Politico. Thank you. Just to follow up on the Russia question, how concerned are you, Secretary General, of active Russian espionage efforts here at NATO headquarters? Are there investigations underway either by the allies or by NATO itself to assess how much damage there was? Some of these diplomats have been here obviously for some time.
So I cannot go into the details about our intelligence, but I can say that the decision to withdraw the accreditation for these 8 people, members of the Russian delegation, is based on the fact that they were not diplomats, they were actually Russian intelligence operatives. And we have seen a pattern of behavior in this country, but also in many other European countries over several years. And allies have again and again expressed grave concerns about very specific actions, as we have seen a coup attempt in Montenegro, hacking on the OPCW in the Netherlands, the poisoning in Salisbury, and many other actions. And of course, we have to act. There is no way you can just accept Russia to conduct malign activities without reacting, and that's what we did. We made it absolutely clear that while we made that decision, we continued to work for dialogue, because we believe that Russia, our biggest neighbor, Russia being there close to NATO, there's no way we cannot talk to them, and therefore we continue to strive for a better relationship with Russia, knowing that this is difficult as the situation is now.
Okay, we'll go to Wall Street Journal just above, and then we'll take a couple of questions from Zoom, and then we'll come back to the room.
Thanks, Juana. James Marston, Wall Street Journal. Secretary General, there have been lots of statements from allies of frustration and exasperation with the US after Afghanistan, the situation with the Australian submarines. There's an impression among some that the Americans are just doing what they want and everyone else is putting up with it because no one really wants to increase spending. Is the Trump era really over, or do you expect the US Secretary of Defense to be welcomed with open arms?
What we see now is a US administration which is strongly committed to rebuilding, strengthening alliances, and in particular strengthening the transatlantic bond between Europe and North America. And that was the clear message from President Biden at the NATO summit in June. That was the clear message from President Biden when I met him in the White House a few weeks ago. And I expect that to be the clear message also from Secretary Austin when he meets with defense ministers tomorrow at the NATO Defense Ministerial meeting. And I think actually we have now a unique historic opportunity that we all should seize, and that is to strengthen the cooperation, the bond between North America and Europe within NATO. And the good news is that we are doing more together. Allies are working more closely together on a wide range of issues: technology, cyber, deterrence, defense, and in many other areas where we are strengthening NATO as 30 allies. And European allies are also stepping up. European allies have, over the last years, significantly increased defense spending. All allies have increased defense spending since we made the pledge in 2014 at the NATO summit. And more allies also meet the 2% guideline, spending 2% of GDP on defense. Then, of course, over the last weeks, we've also seen some difficult issues where we have seen some differences between allies. On Afghanistan, I think it's important to remember that actually we consulted closely with Secretary Austin, with all the defense ministers on several occasions. We had actually 3 ministerial meetings and many ambassadorial meetings, many committee meetings at NATO, where we consulted on the way forward on Afghanistan before we made a very difficult decision, namely to end our military mission there. But when we made that decision, we were clear-eyed about the risks. The risk of Taliban returning, but we also knew that the alternative to stay entailed risks of more violence, more fighting, and also most likely the need for us to increase the number of NATO troops in Afghanistan, and therefore we together made the decision to end our mission in Afghanistan. On the AUKUS deal, well, I understand that France is disappointed. At the same time, I think it's important to underline that this is not a deal directed against NATO or Europe, and I'm confident that the allies involved, they will find a way forward, and our responsibility is to prevent this issue becoming a rift between NATO allies, between North America and Europe. And NATO allies also agreed in June that we need to work more closely with our Asia-Pacific partners, New Zealand, Australia, Japan and South Korea. We have started to work with them on cyber. There are other issues on maritime security and many other areas where we should work more closely with these partners. AUKUS, the disagreement, the differences on opinions about AUKUS within the alliance and Afghanistan does not change the fundamental need and message that Europe and North America has to stand together, because we face a more competitive world, we face more state-to-state rivalry, and then it's even more important that we stand together as the 30 allies in NATO.
Let's go to Thomas Kutschke from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and then we'll come back to Dominika. Thomas, go ahead, please.
Yes, thanks a lot, Joanna, and good afternoon. Secretary General, the Alliance will now operationalize its new concept for deterrence and defense in the Euro-Atlantic area, starting with a new designation or new assignment of the area of responsibilities. Can you please outline what the real challenges will be for NATO to cope with the new security environment and adapting to it in the next years? Thank you.
So NATO has always had plans in place to defend and protect the whole Euro-Atlantic area. But of course, as the security environment changes and as our challenges and potential threats are changing, we need to adapt and modernize those plans. And that's exactly what we are doing, and that will also be addressed when defense ministers meet tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And that's part of this fundamental change of NATO, the fundamental shift within NATO that we have seen over the last years, where we step up when it comes to collective defense, protecting our territory. Allies are investing more, allies are providing more high-end capabilities, and not least, we are also stepping up in new domains as cyber, hybrid, and also space. All of this matters for our security. It's different from the threats and the challenges we faced during the Cold War. It's different from the challenges we faced when most of our efforts were actually outside NATO territory. Not so many years ago, actually, when I came in 2014, the biggest operations we had, they were outside NATO territory. We had tens of thousands of troops in big combat operations outside NATO territory. Now we have scaled that down. And also before we ended the mission in Afghanistan, we gradually scaled that, also the deployment of NATO troops in missions beyond our territory significantly over the last years. But at the same time, in parallel, we have stepped up the readiness of our forces, deployed combat groups in the eastern part of the alliance, invested in new capabilities, and also modernized the whole NATO command structure, including with new commands, for instance, in Germany. So this, of course, is then reflected in the plans and the concepts and the doctrines we have developed in parallel with this fundamental shift. And I think sometimes we underestimate the fundamental change that has taken place in NATO over the last 7 years, reducing resources, efforts, in operations outside NATO territory, and then strongly increasing the efforts within NATO territory to strengthen our collective defense.
Okay, we'll try to go back to Dominika Czosic from TVP Poland.
Yes, hello. I hope that now everything is okay. Secretary General, I would like to ask you on Belarusia's situation, border with Poland. Yesterday, Deputy Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs has briefed NATO ambassadors on this situation on the border between Poland and Belarus. And as you know, of course, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia are under attack of a hybrid attack of a Belarusian regime who is using forced migration and also a strong disformation campaign against Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. So my question is if and what and when NATO is doing to solve this problem before it will become a major problem on eastern border of NATO. Thank you very much.
So NATO stands in solidarity with our allies, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, that have seen a surge in migrants coming in from Belarus. This flow of migrants is something which is orchestrated and used by Belarus as a form of hybrid warfare. And therefore, I think it's important that we also have discussed and addressed this actually several times in NATO at the North Atlantic Council, and most recently we did that this week, again expressing our solidarity and also recognizing that this is something which is orchestrated by the regime in Minsk. NATO allies have also deployed experts to Lithuania to help them cope with the challenges related to the surge in migrants entering the European Union and their countries via Belarus. We are, of course, continuing to stand in very close contact. I have also spoken with many of the political leaderships or people in the political leadership in these countries addressing exactly these same challenges. At the same time, it is important that all those fleeing violence and persecution should be treated with care and compassion. So that's also an important message to convey as we continue to stand in solidarity with our NATO allies, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia.
And we'll take another question from Zoom, from Florian Neuhan from ZDF, and then we'll come back to the press room.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my question. Secretary General, I'd like to speak about the lessons learned from Afghanistan. And would you agree that one, maybe the most important lesson would be to always have an exit strategy for your missions? And what would that mean for current NATO missions, such as Iraq, for example? Thank you.
So first of all, we are in the midst of the lessons learned process. I, as NATO ministers, will engage in that process later on this week. I think it is important to have a thorough and clear-eyed lessons learned process, because this was a big operation that lasted over many, many years. And of course, exit strategy, how to end these kind of military missions, is an important part of what we have to look into as we now do the lessons learned process. I think also we have to realize that NATO went into Afghanistan to fight terrorism. And in the beginning, we had a limited task of degrading Al-Qaeda, fighting international terrorism. Then gradually the mission expanded, and that was not only NATO but the whole international community that added on more and more tasks, and then it developed into more a nation-building effort by the whole international community. NATO was part of that, but of course also the UN, the European Union, and many individual allies who went in with heavy development aid and also ambitions to build a democratic and stable Afghanistan. So from a more limited mission fighting terrorism, the whole international community with a lot of different allies and organizations and partners engaged, ended up in something that became a quite big and ambitious nation-building effort. So I think we all have to realize how a mission can gradually expand, and also the risks and the challenges related to such a change of the goals and the purpose of our presence. So there are lessons to be learned for NATO, but also for the broader international community. It's too early to conclude, but I think at least one thing is that we need to also recognize the things that didn't work, but also the things that actually worked. And for 20 years, we prevented Afghanistan being a safe haven for international terrorists. And that was the main reason we went in. And now it's important to try to preserve those gains. And we will continue to stay vigilant. We continue to work together as allies. We continue to be part of the global coalition to defeat Daesh. To make sure, and we continue to use our leverage, political, diplomatic leverage on the Taliban regime to ensure the gains we made in many areas, but in particular when it comes to fighting terrorism. And the other message I have is that we should not draw the wrong conclusions. And if anything, Afghanistan just demonstrates the need for allies to stand together to strengthen the link between North America and Europe. And many things was difficult, and of course the fact that Taliban is back is a tragedy for the Afghan people, and it's heartbreaking for all of us who support Afghanistan for so many years. But the fact that allies, European allies and North America, US, Canada, that we were able to evacuate more than 120,000 people in a matter of few days, that was a huge undertaking, demonstrating the capabilities NATO allies can bring to bear when needed, and that's also important to remember as we do the lessons learned process.
Okay, we'll go to Brussels morning, third row, yeah.
Thank you very much. Secretary General, you said that the decision to take it was so difficult and risky. I think it was more difficult to think if withdrawal is happening with this. All achievement in 20 years is gone. There is nothing left behind in Afghanistan. It's still terrorist group like Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and also Haqqani network. They are very active in Afghanistan. Don't you think that it will be dangerous, not only for Afghanistan and also for the world? What is NATO plan for the future, and how do you defend this terrorist group which is active in Afghanistan and could be more difficult and challenging for the world for the future? Thank you.
It was a difficult decision because we faced a dilemma, either to stay and then, of course, risk more casualties, not only casualties and loss of lives of NATO soldiers, but also more civilian Afghan casualties, because more fighting means also more both military and civilian casualties. And we risked to be forced to increase the number of NATO troops in Afghanistan. But the alternative was then to leave and then risk the return of Taliban, and that was clearly conveyed, and all allies were aware that if we left, there was a clear risk for Taliban returning to power in Kabul. What was not anticipated was the speed of the return of Taliban, but not the fact that they were able to come back. Of course, much of the gains we have made are now also, for instance, when it comes to democratic rights, the freedom of press, and all those gains, we have seen serious setbacks, and the reports and what we learn about the new Taliban regime is of deep concern, and allies are deeply concerned about the developments within Afghanistan, especially when it comes to the rights of women. At the same time, I think it's important to also recognize that we have seen some fundamental changes in the Afghan society over these 20 years. Partly just because the fact that so many more people have been educated, This is social and economic progress which cannot be easily reversed, that people have been empowered, that not least women have had access to education in a way they didn't have when Taliban ruled. And also the fact, and of course this is not only something that can be credited to NATO. That social and economic progress was part of the broader nation-building efforts by the whole international community, also UN, many allies. I remember I was Prime Minister of Norway. We invested a lot, not through NATO, but through the UN in bilateral development aid to support the civilian society, democratic values, freedom of press, and so on in Afghanistan. So that's a loss for all of us, the whole international community. And then I also strongly believe that the gains we have made in the fight against terrorism, we will stay vigilant. We will continue to preserve those gains by coordinating efforts by NATO allies, by using the leverage we have, the diplomatic economic leverage, and that's exactly what NATO allies are doing, and also by the fact that NATO allies, especially the United States, they have the capabilities to strike terrorists groups also from long distance over the horizon, and as they have done in many other countries where they don't have thousands of troops on the ground. So yes, what has happened in Afghanistan over the last weeks is really heartbreaking. It's painful to see, and we see that especially those who believed in democratic values, freedom of press, the rights of women, they have all reasons to be gravely disappointed and shocked by what they have seen, or what we have all seen in Afghanistan. But we should continue to put pressure to use our leverage. And for instance, I know that many NATO allies and partners are also now engaging strongly with different kind of humanitarian organizations, relief organizations, to continue to provide direct support to the people of Afghanistan, and also to different groups and individuals who are at risks, and NATO allies are doing that through different channels than NATO, and I welcome those efforts.
We'll go to Radio France Internationale.
Merci, voilà. Oui, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, to come back quickly on my colleague's questions on Russia, if you want to keep the dual-track approach alive, what are the next tangible or practical steps that you are willing to plan or to take in order to rebuild the dialogue with Russia?
So our offer to convene a meeting on the NATO-Russia Council still stands, and we are ready to meet with Russia as soon as they are willing to sit down with us, because we strongly believe that, especially when things are difficult, when tensions are high, then it is extra important that we are able to meet and discuss. Then, of course, we have also other avenues for engaging with Russia. We have military lines of communications, and there are other ways to engage with Russia. We will use those to continue to engage with Russia. I also welcome the strategic talks between the United States and Russia, and the efforts of the United States to really engage in meaningful strategic talks with Russia, and the extension of the New START agreement also reflects that there are some important steps that has been taken recently. But again, the relationship between NATO and Russia is at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War. And the reason for that is the Russian behavior. I mean, they have invaded neighbors. They have annexed part of another country. They are investing heavily in new nuclear capabilities, violating one of the cornerstones of our arms control regime, the INF Treaty, that led to the demise of that treaty. They are meddling in our democratic processes, and we have seen Russia being responsible for aggressive actions against NATO allies. So this totality has led to the setbacks we have seen in the effort to try to have a meaningful dialogue with Russia. But we will continue defense and dialogue, and sooner or later, also at some stage, it is important to realize also for Russia that we all will live in a safer world if we engage in meaningful dialogue.
Okay, we'll go to Deutsche Welle, NPR, Terry Schultz, and then we'll go to James.
Okay, good. So I don't have to ask anything for a friend then. Thanks. People have already asked on Afghanistan quite a bit, but I wanted to just have a little bit more precision on a couple of things that I think you didn't answer completely. Do you still see that NATO has a role in Afghanistan? Because you used to mention that Afghanistan was an example of how NATO fights counterterrorism. We know that there is still the threat of terrorism, as you have mentioned, but is that still a NATO role, or do you see that falling now only to national governments, especially those who will have assets based in the region? Will NATO play a coordinating role, anything like that? And do you feel that this is important for this to be kept inside the alliance? And I'm wondering that ahead of course, the lessons learned process, which will take will take some time, I'm wondering if you could share with us reflections that you've had already. I know you haven't had a lot of free time, but we've been through this process the whole time that you've been here, and I'm wondering if you could share with us some of your own thoughts on lessons learned before writing a report and making it much more bureaucratic. Thank you.
Well, the most urgent role NATO has, or the most immediate task we are faced with, is to resettle Afghans who work with us. And NATO allies were able to get, and partners were able to get more than 120,000 people, many of them Afghans, out of Afghanistan. And we still, allies and partners are still working on how to get more people out. We have been also able to get out many people who worked directly with NATO, not only NATO allies, but also NATO as an institution or as an alliance. We have used actually part of the NATO response force to set up transition centers in Kosovo, in Poland, and also help the efforts at the Ramstein air base. NATO allies and NATO has been involved in those efforts. And now what is important is to be able to resettle these individuals. We are making huge progress, making sure that they are not staying in these transit centers, but are actually able to be resettled in different NATO allied countries. So this is an issue that I expect will be addressed when we discuss Afghanistan tomorrow, and also an issue that I have been addressing when I engage with NATO allies, and NATO as an institution has been working hard on getting people out, the transit centers, and then the importance of resettle people that supported us and worked for us over all these years. Then actually I think I reflected a bit on the lessons learned, not any conclusions, but I said something about what we saw in Afghanistan, that we started with a very limited, narrow military mission, fighting terrorism, degrading Al-Qaeda, and then NATO was part of what after some years become a much more broader mission. But then NATO was only one of many players or actors, meaning the UN, EU, individual allies in a much broader nation-building effort. And I think it's too easy to say that that was absolutely wrong, because that actually achieved a lot, and not least when it comes to social and economic progress, but it's a much more ambitious task, and therefore also, of course, much harder to preserve those gains than the gains we made related to the original task to degrade Al-Qaeda and preserve or prevent Afghanistan being a safe haven for international terrorists. So any reflections on that dilemma, whether we should have stayed on this more narrow task of fighting terrorism, or whether it was right for the international community, and NATO being part of that, to engage in a more bigger, ambitious nation-building task, I think that will be one of the big dilemmas we will face. Another reflection I have, and it's too early to say whether all allies will agree, is that, of course, it highlights the challenges and the risks to engage in big missions and operations outside NATO territory. But the lesson cannot be that we will never engage. Because, for instance, I think it's absolutely clear that the use of military force by NATO allies, and NATO also being part of the global coalition to defeat Daesh in Iraq and Syria, that was right. I'm not saying that everything is fixed, that all the problems are solved, and that we can just step back and relax. But I say that we should not draw the wrong conclusion of Afghanistan and think that NATO allies and NATO should never again engage in military operations to fight extremism or terrorism, because we did that recently in Iraq and Syria. And that was the main reason we were able to liberate a territory as big as the United Kingdom, 8 million people, and actually seriously degrade ISIS. And NATO continues to be part of that effort by our training mission in Iraq. Yeah, that's some of my more personal reflections, or my reflections as for the time being on the lesson learned process in Afghanistan.
We've got lots of questions and we're running out of time, so we'll try to do it as quickly as we can. Jane's. No, Jane's over there.
Yes, thanks, Juana. Brooke Signer, Jane's Defense Weekly. Mr. Stoltenberg, you mentioned hypersonic missiles as an evolving threat. It's really not feasible to use nuclear arms against these, which means kinetic. And kinetically, these can only be countered by weapons traveling as fast or faster than the missiles themselves, which means every second counts. So my question to you, do you think Allied military kinetic systems against hypersonic weapons should be placed in space or on the ground? I'm not referring to the international treaties that NATO supports or would like to see. I'm asking about whether these weapons should be placed in space or on the ground. And what is NATO's current position on that? Thank you.
So in general, I would say that NATO is investing, adapting, modernizing its military capabilities to be ready to respond and protect and defend against any threat, including modern missile systems. And we are doing that in many different ways. We are also stepping up what we do in space, because space is so important for our communications, for our ability to detect missile launches, to surveillance, reconnaissance, and to communicate. NATO, we don't have any plans of deploying weapons in space. That's not part of our space efforts. I cannot speak on behalf of all NATO allies, but NATO has no such plans.
Okay, we'll try to take 3 more questions very, very quickly. DPA.
Hans Gase from DPA. Secretary General, on the same issue, China has denied a report that it tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile in August. I would like to know what NATO's assessment is. Do you think that this test had nothing to do with military capabilities? And do you think that this issue will pop up in the discussions at the ministerial in the coming 2 days? Thank you.
What we have seen over the last years is significant modernization of China's military capabilities. I cannot comment on precise intelligence, but what I can say is that we have seen these strong efforts by China to strengthen their military capabilities, including nuclear capabilities and missile systems. This is about new missiles, it's about long-range missiles, it's about dual-capable missiles, and it's also about building new silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarines, air-launched missiles, also sea-based and air-launched missiles, including ground-launched missiles. So in totality, this is a significant modernization of the Chinese armed forces, including a lot of very advanced weapon systems that can carry nuclear weapons.
Süddeutsche Zeitung.
Secretary General, you mentioned the DDA concept. I understand that there will be capability targets that the ministers will be discussing, and I've been told that they will be ambitious. Can you go in a little detail of what that means and what types of systems we're talking about? Or capabilities, not necessarily systems.
Discuss capability targets. We will agree capability targets. And that's one thing that really is important for NATO, is that we have a regular process that addresses the need for new capabilities by NATO allies or NATO allied countries. And then we agree them because then we ensure that as a totality, 30 allies provide the capabilities we need, land, air, sea, cyber. And of course, only a few allies can have a full spectrum defense. Most allies are dependent on other allies for some capabilities. And by joining forces, by working together and agreeing the capability targets, we ensure that we have the capabilities together as allies. Maybe I can be able to say a bit more about that after we have had the meeting of the NATO defense ministers tomorrow. But in general, these capability targets reflect the need to modernize NATO, not only in the land, air, and sea domain, but also, not least within to modernize NATO also when it comes to responding to new and disruptive technologies. So of course, NATO we have plans in place to protect NATO, NATO territory, but we need more than plans. We also need the forces to underpin those plans, and that's exactly what we're going to agree during our defense ministerial meeting this week.
Okay, I know there's still a couple of questions, but we'll end with Rustavi to Georgia.
Secretary General, Mr. Kolomina is in Tbilisi now. Earlier, Secretary of Defense visited Georgia, and one of his main messages was that NATO open door policy remains. So does it mean that will be deeper cooperation, and can we expect some positive signals on upcoming summit in Spain? Thanks.
So first of all, I would like to state very clearly that Georgia remains a very close and highly valued partner of NATO. My special representative, Javier Colomina, is a very experienced and diplomat that really knows how NATO works and also how we can strengthen the partnership with Georgia, and working more closely with the countries in the region, and I know him as a very knowledgeable diplomat that really can help and support us the efforts that NATO does in that region in many different ways. So we will continue to work on how we can further strengthen the partnership with Georgia, how we can make sure that we both provide political and practical support, and I look forward to working with the new special representative on how to do exactly that.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.